My name is Alice Abrams, and this is not a story about madness. Not my madness, anyway. For 1 year of my life, my world, decided I was insane. They locked me away in the cold gray embrace of Blackwood Asylum, a place where truth went to die. But the only madness I ever truly saw was through a rain-streaked window one autumn evening, reflected in the eyes of a man who thought his power made him a god. I saw it again in the faces of the family who chose to believe his lie over their own daughter, their own blood. The story of how I got out, and how a brilliant young doctor risked everything to listen to a madwoman, is the only story that matters. It's the story of how we brought the true madman to justice. Before I dive into the night that shattered my world, I want to hear about yours. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's comforting to know that stories like this can reach across the globe. And if you've ever felt like no one was listening, like your own truth was being denied, hit that like button. You're not alone. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. We are a community built on shared stories, and I am so glad you found us. It began, as so many tragedies do, at a party. The air at Lord Wilbur Harrington's estate was thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and the cloying sweetness of privilege. Hundreds of candles fought against the encroaching October twilight, their flames dancing in the polished silver and glittering on the champagne flutes that seemed to be permanently attached to every guest's hand. I was 20 years old, and I felt like a child playing dress-up in my mother's clothes. My father, a merchant whose recent successes had earned him a precarious invitation into this world, navigated the crowded ballroom with a strained smile, his eyes constantly scanning for opportunity. My mother trailed in his wake, her grip on my arm a little too tight, her whispered reminders to smile, to curtsy, to be charming, a constant hum in my ear. They saw this night as an arrival, a cementing of our family's new status. I just saw a collection of gilded cages. The noise was the worst part, a cacophony of forced laughter, booming pronouncements, and the shrill whine of the string quartet sawed at my nerves. I needed a moment of silence, a single breath of clean air. Excusing myself with a murmur my mother barely acknowledged, I slipped through a set of tall glass doors and found myself in the conservatory. It was another world. The air was warm and humid, smelling of damp earth and blooming night jasmine. Moonlight, filtered through the enormous glass-paned roof, cast long skeletal shadows from the exotic ferns and towering palms. It was a jungle tamed and trapped, and in that moment, I felt a deep kinship with it. In the center of the room, a small marble fountain gurgled peacefully, the sound a balm to my frayed senses. I drifted toward it, trailing my fingers through the cool fronds of a fern, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. That was when I heard the voices. They came from a small alcove, partially hidden behind a monstrously large bird of paradise plant. One voice was low and menacing, a silken growl I recognized instantly as our host's, Lord Harrington. The other was a woman's, soft and pleading, laced with a tremor of fear. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, pulled me closer. I edged behind a thick stone pillar, my heart starting a nervous, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I could see them now. Lord Harrington had a young woman backed against the wall. I knew her face vaguely. She was one of the maids, a girl named Isabel, with wide, frightened eyes and hair, the color of spun straw. He held a small, jewel-encrusted box in his hand, shaking it in her face. "Where is it?" Harrington Sip's voice was stripped of its ballroom charm. It was raw, ugly. "Do not lie to me, girl. My wife Sip's sapphire pendant. I saw you near her dressing room." "I did not take it, my lord," Isobel whispered, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. "I swear on my mother Sep's grave. I was only turning down the linens. I would never—" "You would do whatever you thought you could get away with," he sneered, stepping closer, invading her space until she was flattened against the wall. "You people are all the same. You see something shiny, and your grubby little fingers simply can resist." Tears welled in her eyes, silver tracks in the moonlight. Please, my lord. I have nothing. I did nothing. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic charm, twisted into something foul, an impulse of pure, unchecked rage. He raised his hand, not the open-handed slap of a master correcting a servant, but a closed fist, a gesture of brutal intent. Before I could even process what was happening, before a scream could form in my throat, he struck her, not on the cheek, but a hard, vicious blow to the side of her head. The sound was sickening, a wet thud that echoed in the humid air. Isabel's body went limp, her eyes rolling back. She fell sideways, her head connecting with the sharp, unforgiving edge of the marble fountain, with a crack that was louder than the blow itself. She slid to the floor, a crumpled heap of dark wool and pale skin, and lay utterly still. For a moment, there was only the sound of the gurgling water, a cheerful, obscene counterpoint to the horror. Lord Harrington stared down at her, his chest heaving. There was no shock on his face, no remorse. There was only annoyance, as if she had been a vase he had carelessly knocked over. He nudged her with the toe of his polished shoe. She didn't move. He knelt, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, his movements brisk and practiced. When he stood up, his face was a pale, calculating mask. He hadn't just killed her, he was already solving the problem of her death. His eyes swept the conservatory, a predator scanning for witnesses, and then they found me. They locked onto my face, peering from behind the stone pillar. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. In his eyes, I saw no flicker of humanity, only a cold, reptilian assessment. I was not a person to him. I was a loose thread in his perfect tapestry, a complication to be dealt with. The terror that had been frozen in my lungs burst forth in a strangled gasp. I didn't think. I just ran. I turned and fled back into the ballroom, stumbling through the glass doors, the sudden blast of noise and light, a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt and warp around me, the smiling faces of the dancers becoming grotesque masks. I pushed through the crowd, my breath coming in ragged sobs, searching for the familiar anchor of my parents. I found them near the grand staircase, my father deep in conversation with a portly councilman. "Father!" I cried, grabbing his arm. My voice was a shredded wreck. "Father, you have to," in the conservatory. My father turned, his face a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Alice, what is it? You look a fright." "Lord Harrington," I stammered, the words tumbling over each other. "The maid, Isabel," he hit her, and she fell. Her head, I think she sets dead. He killed her. The councilman's eyes widened. My father's face went white, then flushed a deep, mottled red. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into my arm, and pulled me toward a small, empty alcove beneath the stairs. "What are you saying?" he hissed, his voice a furious whisper. "Are you mad? You cannot say such things. Do you have any idea who that man is?" "I saw it," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. "He killed her. We have to call the police." "Quiet," my mother whispered, her face ashen. "Someone will hear you." It was then that a shadow fell over us. "Is everything all right, Abrams?" Lord Harrington's voice was smooth as silk, drenched in false concern. He stood there, perfectly composed, not a hair out of place. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I flinched away as if I'd been burned. "My lord," my father stammered, bowing his head slightly. "My daughter, she's not feeling well. A bit overwrought, the excitement of the evening." Harrington's eyes, cold as chips of ice, met mine. He smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. "Ah, yes, young women can be so delicate, prone to flights of fancy. I believe I saw Miss Abrams near the conservatory. Perhaps the heat was too much for her." He turned his gaze to my father. "She has a rather vivid imagination, doesn't she? I recall you mentioning her sensitivity." My father, desperate for an escape hatch, seized the lie like a drowning man, grabbing a rope. "Yes, my lord, exactly. Very sensitive. Always has been. She imagines things." He looked at me, his eyes pleading, commanding. "Play along. For God's sake, play along." But I couldn't. He's lying, I said, my voice shaking but firm. I saw what he did. Harrington sighed, a theatrical sound of deep regret. The poor girl, he said to my parents, as if I wasn't even there. A Sobel, a terrible accident. She must have slipped on the wet marble by the fountain. A tragic loss. He looked back at me, his eyes delivering a silent, chilling message. This is the story. Defy me, and I will destroy you. My world began to shrink in that alcove, collapsing down to the terrified faces of my parents and the cold, triumphant stare of a murderer. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother was already weeping softly, not for the dead girl, but for the impending scandal that threatened her new, fragile social standing. They weren't listening to me. They were listening to him. The lie was already taking root, its poisonous tendrils wrapping around my family, choking the truth before it could even draw breath. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, a masterclass in gaslighting. The official story was just as Harrington had crafted it. The maid had tragically slipped and fallen, a terrible accident. My insistence on what I had seen was met first with strained patience, then with frustration, and finally with a terrifying, unified front of denial. Alice, you were not yourself that night, my mother would say, her hands fluttering nervously. You were tired. The candlelight plays tricks on the eyes. My father was more direct. You will not speak of this again, he ordered, his voice tight with fear. You will ruin us. You will ruin everything I have worked for. They treated my truth as a sickness. My brother Thomas, ever the pragmatist, sided with them completely. Think about this logically, Alice, he'd said, sitting on the edge of my bed where I had taken refuge. Why would a man like Harrington risk everything for a maid? It makes no sense. You must have misinterpreted what you saw. They spoke of logic, of sense, but what they meant was power. It was illogical to challenge power. It made no sense to risk comfort for a truth that could destroy you. Lord Harrington, to my horror, began to visit. He would arrive with flowers for my mother and words of deep, patronizing concern for me. He would sit with my father in his study, the low murmur of their voices a constant, threatening drone. In front of my family, he was the picture of a benevolent nobleman, worried for the fragile mind of a young girl. When he managed to get a moment alone with me, the mask would slip. They will never believe you, he whispered to me once in the hallway, his smile never reaching his eyes. To them, I am the foundation of their new world. You are just a crack in the plaster, and cracks, he added, his voice dropping, get filled in. The final nail in the coffin of my sanity, at least in the eyes of my world, was Dr. Marlowe. He was our family physician, a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose morals were entirely dictated by the wealth of his patients. He arrived at Harrington's suggestion. He listened to my story with a patient, dismissive smile, nodding as if I were a child describing a monster under the bed. He asked me about my moods, my dreams, my female troubles. He spoke to my parents in hushed tones in the parlor. I heard snippets of his diagnosis through the closed door. Hysteria, a morbid fixation, delusions brought on by emotional distress. He was giving my family the words they needed, the medical justification to dispose of a truth they couldn't handle. The decision was made without me. I was informed one morning over a breakfast I couldn't eat. We've made arrangements, Alice, my father said, not looking at me, focusing instead on surgically slicing his toast. For you to get some rest. A place in the countryside. Dr. Marlowe says the air will do you good. Dr. Blackwood at the asylum is a fine man. He will take excellent care of you. Asylum. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy as a tombstone. I stared at him, then at my mother, who was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. You can't, I whispered. You can't do this. I am not insane. I am telling the truth. The truth, my father said, finally looking at me, his face hard and unforgiving, is that you are embarrassing this family. You are endangering our future with these fantasies. This is what is best. You need help. You are sending me away because you are afraid of him, I said, my voice rising. You are choosing him over me. My father slammed his hand on the table. making the fine china rattle. Enough. It is decided. 2 days later, two grim-faced men in drab uniforms arrived with a carriage. There were no markings on it, nothing to announce its destination. It was discreet, efficient. I didn't scream or fight. A strange, chilling calm had settled over me. I looked at my parents, standing in the doorway of our home, the home I had grown up in, and I saw strangers. My father's face was a mask of grim resolve. My mother was weeping, but her tears felt like a performance, a way to absolve herself of her own complicity. Thomas stood behind them, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. They had already made their choice. As the men led me down the path, I looked back one last time. My mother made a small, aborted movement, as if to reach for me, but my father put a hand on her arm, holding her back. They watched as I was locked inside the carriage, as the world I knew was locked away from me. The ride was silent, the windows covered. I was moving through a world that no longer considered me a part of it. When the carriage finally stopped, and the doors opened, I was greeted by the sight of high stone walls, topped with iron spikes, and a large, imposing wooden gate. Above it, carved into the stone archway, were the words Blackwood Asylum for the mentally afflicted. I had arrived at my tomb. The inside of Blackwood Asylum was the color of despair. Gray stone floors, gray plaster walls, gray light filtering through barred windows. The air smelled of boiled cabbage, antiseptic, and a faint, underlying scent of human sorrow. My fine dress was taken from me, folded away with the rest of my former life. I was given a shapeless shift of rough, gray cotton, identical to those worn by the other women I saw drifting through the halls like ghosts. The intake process was a lesson in dehumanization. I was weighed, measured, and inspected like livestock. Dr. Blackwood, the asylum's director, was a tall, severe man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He had my file on his desk, a file no doubt filled with the lies of Dr. Marlowe and the convenient narrative of my family. "Miss Abrams," he said, his voice dry as dust, "I have read your case. This fixation on Lord Harrington is quite severe. A classic erotomanic delusion projected onto a figure of authority, not uncommon in young women of a delicate constitution." "It is not a delusion," I said, my voice hoarse. "I saw him kill a woman." He gave a small, dismissive wave of his hand. "The mind is a powerful thing, my dear. It can create entire worlds that feel as real as this one. Our job here is to help you distinguish between fantasy and reality. You will find that cooperation is the swiftest path to recovery." He didn't believe me. He had no intention of ever believing me. I was a diagnosis, not a person, a box to be ticked. The days bled into one another, a monotonous, soul-crushing routine. Bells dictated when we woke, when we ate the tasteless porridge, when we were herded into the common room, or, on rare sunny days, into the walled garden. The other patients were a lost sea of faces. Some were lost in worlds of their own, muttering to unseen figures or staring blankly at the walls. Others were sharp and lucid. Women discarded by families for being too difficult, too outspoken, or simply too inconvenient. We were the forgotten daughters, the inconvenient wives. We recognized the same hollow look in each other's eyes. I learned quickly to keep to myself, to say little. Any show of anger or frustration was noted down as a symptom of my illness. Any attempt to repeat my story was met with placating smiles and an extra dose of the bitter, cloudy tonic they gave us at night to ensure we slept. I was in a cage designed to prove I belonged there. The more I protested my sanity, the crazier I appeared to them. Hope began to feel like a distant memory, a language I was slowly forgetting how to speak. My sessions with the staff doctors were exercises in futility. They were all older men, cut from the same cloth as Blackwood, firm in their belief that the female mind was a fragile, hysterical thing. They would ask me the same questions over and over, trying to find the root of my fantasy. They suggested it was a misplaced romantic obsession with Lord Harrington, a cry for attention, a manifestation of some hidden childhood trauma. They twisted my words, reinterpreting my memories to fit their diagnosis. Perhaps the maid represented a part of yourself you wish to be free from, one suggested, peering at me over his spectacles. It was maddening. I was drowning, and they were calmly explaining the properties of water to me. Then, 6 weeks into my internment, a new doctor arrived. His name was Alfred Dawson. He was different from the others. He was young, for one thing, probably not yet 30, with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. He didn't carry the same air of pompous authority as the senior staff. There was a quiet intensity about him, a sense of curiosity that the others lacked. The first time I saw him, he was observing the common room, not with the detached clinical gaze of the other doctors, but with a look of genuine troubled empathy. He wasn't just seeing a collection of symptoms, he was seeing the women. Our first scheduled session was in a small, sterile office with a single barred window overlooking the gray courtyard. I went in with my armor on, expecting the same tired questions, the same patronizing tone. I was ready to give my usual clipped, non-committal answers. "Miss Abrams," he began, his voice calm and even. He didn't sit behind his large desk, creating a barrier between us. Instead, he pulled up a chair to sit opposite me, our knees almost touching. "My name is Dr. Dawson. I've read your file." "Then you already know I'm mad," I said, my tone flat. He didn't rise to the bait. "I know what Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Marlowe think. I'm more interested in what you think." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the party, not the end of it. The beginning. What was the music like? What did the champagne taste like? What was your father discussing before you left the room?" The questions threw me off balance. No one had asked me for these kinds of details. They were irrelevant to the delusion. They were details of a real memory. Hesitantly, I began to speak. I described the suffocating heat of the ballroom, the sharp, acidic taste of the cheap champagne my father had praised, the way the violinist's bows seemed to saw back and forth in perfect, unnerving unison. I told him about my father's conversation with the councilman, about paving contracts and city tariffs. I spoke for nearly an hour, and he just listened. He didn't take notes, he just watched my face, his gaze focused and unwavering. "You have a remarkable memory for detail," he said when I finally fell silent. "It's easy to remember when it actually happened," I replied, a hint of my old defiance creeping back into my voice. He nodded slowly. "Tell me what you saw in the conservatory. From the moment you walked through the doors, every detail, the smells, the shadows, the exact words you heard." And so I told him. Again, but this time was different. I wasn't pleading to be believed. I was simply bearing witness, recounting the facts as they had occurred. I described the way the moonlight hit the marble, the pattern of lace on Isabel's collar, the ugly twist of Harrington's mouth, the sickening sound of the impact. As I spoke, the memory, raw and visceral, washed over me, and my voice began to tremble. My hands clenched in my lap. The terror of that moment was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. When I finished, there was a long silence in the room. I braced myself for the placating response, the gentle redirection. It never came. "The way you describe it," Dr. Dawson said, his voice soft, "is not consistent with a hysterical delusion. Hysteria embellishes. It shifts. It is emotionally self-serving. Your account is forensic. It accepts the testimony of a witness." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in the cold darkness of my chest. He's listening. He's actually listening. Our sessions became my lifeline. We met twice a week, and he never pushed me. He let me guide the conversation. We talked about books, about the art I used to paint, about my childhood. He was mapping the contours of my mind, and I knew he wasn't finding the madness everyone else insisted was there. He was finding a person. In turn, I learned small things about him. He was from a small town, had fought with his own traditionalist father to pursue medicine, and believed the current methods for treating mental illness were barbaric and misguided. He believed in listening, in understanding the story behind the sickness. One afternoon, he brought a chess set to our session. I find a game of chess can reveal a great deal about a person's mind, he said with a small smile. Logic, foresight, the ability to adapt. We played in comfortable silence. I had always loved the game, the clean logic of it a comfort in a chaotic world. I played carefully, defensively at first, but soon I was seeing patterns, planning several moves ahead. I trapped his rook, then forced his knight into a useless position. I could feel his surprise. After a long, thoughtful pause, he moved his queen, leaving his king vulnerable. It was a test, a sacrifice to see if I would recognize the opening. I saw it instantly. "Checkmate," I said quietly, moving my bishop. He looked from the board to my face, and for the first time, I saw a look of absolute certainty in his eyes. "Indeed," he said, "the mind that can see that move is not a mind lost in fantasy, Miss Abrams." That was the day he began his own investigation. He couldn't do much from within the asylum walls, but he was methodical. He spent his evenings in the town library, poring over back issues of the local newspapers. A week later, he came to our session with a barely suppressed excitement. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of a tiny article from the society pages, dated 2 days after the party. It mentioned the unfortunate and accidental death of a servant at the Harrington estate. Isobel Miller, age 19, died from a fall, the official story, printed in black and white. "It matches," he said, his voice low. "Your timeline, the name, the cause of death. It's all there." "It's his story," I whispered, my throat tight. "The one he created." "Yes," Alfred said, his eyes intense. "But a story once written down can be examined. It can be picked apart. This proves you didn't invent a dead maid. She was real, and she died exactly when and where you said she did." This small piece of validation felt like a tidal wave. It was proof, tangible proof, that my memory was not a phantom. I could feel tears welling in my eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sadness, but of profound, aching relief. He believed me. Someone in this God-forsaken world finally believed me. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at the barred window, then back at me. His expression was grim. "Getting the world to believe you is another matter entirely. Dr. Blackwood is in Harrington's pocket. Your family has disowned your story. A petition for your release would be denied before the ink was dry. They would say I've been taken in by your delusion, that my inexperience makes me susceptible." He paused, taking a deep breath. "There is no official way out of here for you, Alice." The hope that had soared so high, just moments before, crashed back to earth. "So I am to stay here forever?" "No," he said, his voice firm, his gaze meeting mine with a new, dangerous intensity. "We are going to get you out." The weight of his words settled over me. He wasn't talking about a release, he was talking about an escape. "They will ruin you," I said, the words catching in my throat. "If we are caught, they will destroy your career. They might even have you committed." "Some things are more important than a career," he said simply. "Justice for that girl, Isobel, is one of them. Your freedom is another." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. It was a simple, grounding gesture, the first truly human touch I had felt in months. "I will not leave you in here to rot, but you must be strong, you must be patient, and you must trust me completely." In that moment, looking into his determined face, I felt a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. The despair that had been my constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. They had taken my life, my name, my freedom. I was going to take it back. "Then we cannot be caught," I said, my voice steady, echoing the words back to him. The game had changed. It was no longer about survival, it was about retribution, and for the first time since that night in the conservatory, I wasn't playing alone. The asylum, once my prison, became a puzzle to be solved. Alfred and I used our sessions, not for therapy, but for planning. We were a conspiracy of two, operating under the ever-watchful eyes of the staff. We spoke in hypotheticals, discussing the plot of a novel Alfred claimed to be reading, a story of a wrongful imprisonment and a daring escape. The protagonist would need to know the guards' routines. He'd muse, and I would spend the next week observing, noting the precise minute an orderly took his tea break, which nurse was prone to gossiping in the linen closet, how long the night watchman spent in the West Wing before circling back to the East. I became a ghost, a silent observer, my supposed madness the perfect camouflage. No one paid attention to the quiet woman staring at a wall. They never suspected she was timing their movements. Alfred, meanwhile, was mapping the asylum's physical form. He had access to the building's original blueprints, stored in the archives under the guise of academic research into institutional architecture. At night, in his small Spartan quarters, he would trace the labyrinthine corridors, the forgotten service tunnels, the weaknesses in the century-old structure. He discovered a disused laundry chute that ended in a basement room near the kitchens, a possible route. He identified the windows with the most rusted bars, the doors with the oldest, most fallible locks. We were patient, meticulous. We knew we would likely only have one chance. Our first plan was simple, perhaps too simple: a key, copied from a wax impression Alfred would make of the master key in Dr. Blackwood's office. A dash across the grounds during the changing of the night shift. It was risky, but feasible. We set a date. The night of the new moon, 2 weeks away. A fragile, terrifying hope began to bloom in my chest. I could almost taste the free air, feel the solid earth under my feet. But the asylum had a cruel rhythm of its own. A week before our planned escape, a patient in the violent ward, a man tormented by unseen demons, managed to break free from his room. His rampage was brief and ultimately harmless, but it sent a shockwave of fear through the administration. Dr. Blackwood, his reputation on the line, initiated a crackdown. New locks were installed on every door. The number of night watchmen was doubled. Surprise inspections of the rooms became a nightly occurrence. Our window of opportunity had slammed shut. The despair was a physical blow. It felt like the walls were closing in, the grayness of the asylum seeping into my very bones. Alfred, too, was shaken. His face was pale and drawn during our next session. "The new locks are from a company in London," he said, his voice low and defeated. "They are unpickable, and with the extra guards, it's impossible." We sat in silence, the weight of our failure heavy in the small room. The hope that had sustained me felt like a cruel joke. I was a fool to have believed I could ever escape. This was my life now, this gray, silent world. It was during this low point that an unlikely and unwitting ally emerged. Her name was Nurse Gable. She was the head nurse of my ward, a stern, unsmiling woman who seemed to be carved from granite. She ran the ward with an iron fist and rarely spoke a word that wasn't in order. She had always watched Alfred's interest in me with a suspicious eye, and I feared it was only a matter of time before she reported his unorthodox methods to Blackwood. One afternoon, she cornered Alfred in the hallway just after our session. I was being led back to the common room, but lingered near the doorway, straining to hear. "Dr. Dawson," she said, her voice sharp. "A word." I saw Alfred brace himself. "Nurse Gable." "You spend a great deal of time with the Abrams girl," she stated. Not a question but an accusation. "More than with any other patient. You bring her books. Chess sets. The others have noticed. Dr. Blackwood will notice soon, if he hasn't already." "I believe her case requires a more dedicated approach," Alfred said carefully. Nurse Gable stared at him for a long moment, her eyes, usually hard and impenetrable, seeming to search his face. "You believe her, don't you?" she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Her story about Lord Harrington." Alfred's silence was his answer. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. She would report him. It was over. But Nurse Gable did not move. She glanced down the empty corridor, then looked back at Alfred. 5 years ago, she said, her voice so low it was almost a breath of air, before I came to Blackwood, I was a nurse at the county hospital. A young girl was brought in from the Harrington estate, a kitchen maid. They said she fell down a flight of stairs. She died before morning. She paused, and the memory seemed to flicker in her cold eyes. The bruises on her arms, on her back, they didn't match the story. They looked like she'd been held down. I said as much to the physician in charge. He told me to mind my own business. The official report read accidental death. Lord Harrington made a generous donation to the hospital the following week. She looked directly at Alfred, a current of understanding passing between them. I am a woman of rules, doctor. I do not break them, but I do not like seeing them broken by powerful men who buy their way out of wickedness. She took a step closer. The service door in the east wing, the one that leads out behind the kitchens, is supposed to be locked and bolted at all times, but the lock is old and often sticks. And the key, she added, her eyes flicking toward a small key hook on the wall of the nurse's station, is often misplaced on Tuesday nights, especially during the final rounds around 2 in the morning. She said nothing more. She simply gave him a sharp, final nod and walked away, her back ramrod straight, leaving Alfred standing stunned in the hallway. She hadn't offered to help. She had given him a weapon, plausible deniability, a path. She had seen one injustice she could not stop, and she was not going to stand by and watch another. Alfred relayed the conversation to me at our next meeting, his voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. A new plan began to form, more daring and more dangerous than the last. Tuesday night, the service door behind the kitchens. I would need a disguise, a diversion, and the nerve of a soldier going into battle. Alfred would arrange for a carriage to be waiting on the service road a quarter-mile from the asylum gates. He would create the diversion himself. I have been experimenting with certain chemical compounds, he explained, a glint in his eye, for a new treatment for melancholia. A combination of sulfur and potassium nitrate, when heated, produces a great deal of thick, foul-smelling, but ultimately harmless, smoke. It should be enough to draw most of the staff to the West Wing Infirmary. My role was more perilous. I had to get from my room on the second floor, down through the heart of the asylum, to the East Wing service door, all without being seen. You'll need a disguise, Alfred said. He handed me a folded bundle of dark fabric. It was a doctor's spare coat, and these, he gave me a pair of round, wire-rimmed spectacles. With your hair pinned up, in the dark, you might pass for one of the junior physicians at a glance. The night of the escape, a storm rolled in, a gift from the heavens. Rain lashed against the windows and wind, howled through the eaves, a perfect symphony to cover any small sounds we might make. I lay in my bed, fully clothed under my thin blanket, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I did not sleep. I listened to the sounds of the asylum settling down for the night, the distant clang of a gate, the soft tread of the nurse's shoes, the mournful cries of a disturbed patient. Each sound was magnified, each second stretched to an eternity. At precisely 1:30, I heard a faint commotion from the far side of the building, a muffled shout, then another. The smell came a moment later, a putrid, acrid scent like rotten eggs, snaking under my door. The diversion, Alfred's plan, was in motion. I heard footsteps hurrying down the hall, away from my room, toward the source of the chaos. Now, it was now or never. Slipping out of bed, I pulled on the heavy doctor's coat, shoved the glasses onto my face, and pinned up my hair as best I could in the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the pins. Steady, Alice. Steady. I took a deep breath, opened my door a crack, and peered out. The hallway was empty. The lone lamp at the far end cast long, dancing shadows. My journey had begun. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a gunshot. I moved through the sleeping asylum like a phantom, my back pressed to the wall, my senses screamingly alert. I descended the main staircase, my heart in my throat as I passed the empty nurse's station. I saw the key hook Nurse Gable had indicated, A single iron key was hanging there. She had kept her word. My fingers closed around the cold metal, a small, solid piece of hope. The east wing was darker, quieter. This was where the kitchens and laundry rooms were. Deserted at this hour. The service door was at the end of a long, narrow corridor, just as Alfred's map had shown. I was almost there, and then I heard it. A cough, a heavy footstep. An orderly was coming around the corner, making an unscheduled round. There was nowhere to hide. My blood ran cold. I flattened myself into a shallow alcove, trying to melt into the shadows, praying he wouldn't look my way. He ambled down the hall, a large, shambling figure, swinging a lantern that sent shadows, lurching and reeling across the walls. He was humming a tuneless, dismal song. He passed my hiding spot without a glance, his mind on other things. I waited until his footsteps faded, my body trembling so violently I thought my bones would rattle apart. I scrambled to the door, my shaking hands struggling to fit the key into the lock. It turned with a loud, grating click. I winced, pausing, listening. Nothing. I pulled the heavy bolt, the sound echoing in the confined space. Then I pushed the door open. A blast of cold, wet wind and the scent of rain-soaked earth hit me, a smell of life, of freedom. I slipped outside, pulling the door shut behind me, and ran. I ran through the muddy kitchen garden, the doctor's coat heavy and cumbersome, the rain plastering my hair to my face. I scrambled over a low stone wall and found the service road. In the distance, half hidden by the driving rain, I saw the silhouette of a carriage and the faint, welcoming glow of a single lantern. Alfred. He threw the carriage door open as I approached. "Get in," he urged, his voice tight with tension. I tumbled inside, collapsing onto the seat, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone but gloriously, terrifyingly free. He jumped in after me, shouting at the driver, and the carriage lurched forward into the stormy darkness, away from the gray walls of Blackwood, away from the tomb that had been built to contain me. But as we fled, I knew this was not the end. Escaping was not enough. Harrington was still out there, powerful and untouched. Isabel was still dead. We were not just running away from the asylum. We were running toward a final, desperate confrontation. We couldn't just disappear. We had to have proof, something undeniable that would shatter the world of lies he had so carefully constructed. In Alfred's research into Harrington's affairs, he had learned of the man's meticulous nature. He was arrogant, but he was not careless. He kept detailed private ledgers, records of all his transactions, legitimate and otherwise. These books were his secret weapon, and Alfred had discovered from a disgruntled former valet that he kept them in a hidden safe in his city residence study. That was our target. Harrington was hosting a major fundraiser for a political ally in 2 days' time. The house would be full of people. Security would be focused on the guests, not the staff. It was our only chance. It was insane, running from an asylum straight into the lion's den, but it was the only move we had left on the board. The carriage rattled through the night, carrying us toward a reckoning. I was no longer the frightened girl who had hidden behind a pillar in a conservatory. The asylum had burned away my fear, leaving something harder, something more resolute in its place. I was a witness, and I was finally going to be heard. 2 days later, the city air was electric, with the impending confrontation. We had taken refuge in a small, anonymous boarding house on the far side of town, using the last of the money Alfred had on him. From this cramped, damp room, we finalized our desperate plan. I was to be a ghost at the feast. Alfred had used his funds to procure a simple maid's uniform for me, gray and unremarkable, the irony of which was not lost on me. He, in turn, had a respectable but slightly worn suit, enough to pass for a minor functionary or a scholar hoping to curry favor. Our story was that I was his cousin, new to the city, and he had secured me a temporary position for the night to help with the event. It was thin, but it might be enough to get me through the staff entrance. The night of the fundraiser, Lord Harrington's city residence was ablaze with light, a beacon of power and influence in the heart of the metropolis. Carriages lined the street, disgorging a river of silk, jewels, and self-importance. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, but my hands were steady as I pinned on my maid's cap. Alfred gripped my shoulder, his eyes meeting mine. "Remember the plan, Alice. In and out. Find the ledger. Leave the rest to me." He had sent a letter via a trusted messenger to the one man in the city who had no love for Harrington. Police Inspector Davies, a bulldog of a man whose career had been stymied several times by Harrington's political manipulations. The letter detailed everything: the murder, the cover-up, the asylum, and the ledger. It urged Davies to arrive at the residence in precisely 1 hour. We weren't just stealing proof, we were setting a trap. Alfred joined the throng of guests flowing through the main entrance while I slipped around to the cacophony of the rear service entrance. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the frantic energy of the kitchen staff. No one gave me a second glance. I was just another anonymous cog in the great machine of the household. I murmured something about being sent from the agency to help with the coats and was waved through with an impatient gesture. I was inside. My first task was to find the study. Alfred's information placed it on the second floor, at the end of the east wing, overlooking the gardens. Keeping my head down, carrying a silver tray I'd picked up as a prop, I navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the house. The muffled roar of the party below was a constant reminder of the stakes. Finally, I found it. A heavy oak door, slightly ajar. I slipped inside and closed it behind me, my back pressing against the wood, my breath held tight in my chest. The room was the heart of Harrington's power. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive desk, and the faint scent of cigar smoke and old money. Behind a large, imposing portrait of what must have been one of Harrington's ancestors was the safe. But I had no way to open it. Alfred's part of the plan was to create a subtle distraction, drawing Harrington from the party and hopefully to his study. He would then deal with the safe. My job was to stand watch, to ensure no one else entered. I waited. The minutes stretched, each tick of the grandfather clock in the corner a hammer blow to my nerves. Then, I heard voices in the hall, footsteps approaching. I ducked behind a heavy velvet curtain just as the door opened. It was Lord Harrington, and he was not alone. He was with the politician he was hosting, a florid, sweating man. "The papers are in here, Marcus," Harrington was saying, "a small matter of land rights. It will all be taken care of." He strode to his desk, completely unaware of my presence. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. This was wrong. Alfred was supposed to be here. Where was Alfred? Harrington pulled a key from his waistcoat, unlocked a drawer in his desk, and retrieved a folder of documents. As he turned back to his guest, his eyes, purely by chance, scanned the room. His gaze swept past my hiding place, and then it stopped. It snapped back. He had seen something. The edge of my gray skirt, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. His charming smile never wavered. He handed the folder to the politician. "Why don't you look this over in the library, Marcus? It's much more comfortable. I'll join you in a moment." He ushered the man out and closed the door, his eyes still fixed on the curtain. The soft click of the lock turning echoed in the silent room. He knew. "You can come out now," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Hiding is so undignified." Slowly, I stepped out from behind the curtain. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, in genuine shock, a flicker of disbelief that the mad girl from the asylum was standing in his study. Then the shock was replaced by a cold, simmering fury. "You," he breathed. "How in God's name did you get out?" "The truth has a way of unbarring doors, my lord," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The truth? You pathetic creature. You are a fantasy, a ghost. I will have you back in your cell by morning." He took a step toward me. "What are you doing here? Did you think you could, what? Rob me?" "I came for Isabel," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I came because I saw what you did to her. I saw you murder an innocent girl, and then buy your way out of it like you were settling a bill with your tailor." His face darkened, the mask of civility finally shattering. She was a thief. She got what she deserved. She was a girl, I countered, taking a step forward, no longer retreating. And you were a bully with a title. That's all you've ever been. At that exact moment, the study door clicked open. It was Alfred. He held a small, heavy-looking steel instrument in his hand, a drill he'd concealed in his coat. He had been working on the lock. He stopped dead, taking in the scene. Harrington spun around, his face contorting with rage. "You, the meddling doctor! I'll have you struck off. I will ruin you both!" He lunged, not at me, but at Alfred, seeing him as the greater threat. But Alfred was ready. He sidestepped Harrington's clumsy charge, raising his hands. "It's over, Harrington," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "Inspector Davies and his men will be here any minute. I've already sent them everything." Harrington froze. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Alfred replied, his eyes flicking to the safe. "Your ledgers, the payments to Dr. Marlowe, to Dr. Blackwood, the hush money to Isobel's family. Is that a bluff, or is it just meticulous bookkeeping?" The color drained from Harrington's face. He was trapped. The arrogance that had been his armor for so long crumbled, revealing the panicked, cornered animal beneath. He let out a roar of fury and lunged again, this time at the desk, grabbing a heavy silver letter opener. He turned toward me, his eyes wild with a murderous light. "If I am to be ruined, I will finish what I started." He came at me, the letter opener raised like a dagger. I stumbled backward, my hand hitting the heavy desk. My fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound book, one of his precious ledgers that he'd left out. Acting on pure instinct, I grabbed it and hurled it at him. The heavy volume caught him square in the chest, making him stagger back with a grunt of pain. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to give Alfred the opening he needed. He launched himself at Harrington, tackling him around the waist. The two men crashed to the floor, wrestling for the letter opener. The commotion was deafening. I heard shouting from the hallway, the sound of the party guests being disturbed. The study door burst open, and suddenly the room was full of people, shocked guests in their finery, frightened servants, and at the forefront, a stern, powerfully built man with a grim expression. Inspector Davies had arrived. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Two uniformed constables moved past him, pulling a struggling, spitting Harrington off of Alfred. They wrenched the letter opener from his grasp. Alfred got to his feet, breathing heavily, his suit torn. "Lord Harrington," Davies said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "you are under arrest for the murder of Isobel Miller." Harrington stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage, a caged beast who couldn't comprehend how the bars had appeared around him. All the power, all the money, all the influence had evaporated in an instant. He was just a man, a killer, exposed under the bright, unforgiving lights of his own home. My eyes met Alfred's across the chaotic room. A look of profound, exhausted relief passed between us. We had done it. It was over. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The arrest of Lord Wilbur Harrington at his own party, accused of murder by a young woman he had conspired to lock in an asylum, was the scandal of the decade. The city's newspapers feasted on it for weeks. I gave my statement to Inspector Davies, my voice clear and unwavering as I recounted the events in the conservatory for what felt like the 100th time. But this time, people listened. This time, they believed. The ledger Alfred had pointed to was the key. It was a meticulous record of Harrington's corruption, detailing the exact sums paid to Dr. Marlowe for his false diagnosis and to Dr. Blackwood for my continued illegal imprisonment. It was an ironclad case. Alfred, as he had predicted, faced a professional inquiry. He was accused of gross misconduct, of aiding a patient's escape, of acting unethically, but he stood before the medical board, calm and resolute, and told the truth. He presented his notes on my case, his observations of my lucidity, his step-by-step reasoning that led him to believe me. Inspector Davies, seeing Alfred as a crucial witness, spoke on his behalf. And then, an anonymous letter arrived for the board. It was from a nurse, it said, with many years of service, who could attest to Dr. Dawson's impeccable character and his deep, unwavering concern for his patients' well-being. It also mentioned a long-held suspicion regarding the accidental deaths of young staff at the Harrington estate. It was Nurse Gable. She had broken her rules one last time. My reunion with my family was not the tearful, cinematic reconciliation I might have once dreamed of. It was a quiet, brittle affair in the sterile visiting room of a solicitor's office. They arrived looking older, diminished. My father's bluster was gone, replaced by a weary shame. My mother seemed to have shrunk, her face a web of worried lines. They had read the newspapers. They knew the truth now, the truth they had refused to see. Alice, my father began, his voice rough. We are so sorry. We were wrong. We were afraid. You left me there, I said, my voice not accusatory, but flat, with the simple, unalterable weight of fact. You signed the papers. You turned your backs and walked away. We thought you were ill, my mother whispered, her hand twisting a damp handkerchief. We wanted to protect you and the family. You wanted to protect yourselves, I corrected her, my gaze steady. You chose comfort over your daughter. You chose a powerful man, Sip's lie over my truth. I understand why you did it. I understand fear, but understanding it isn't the same as forgiving it. They had no answer to that. The chasm that had opened between us was too wide to be crossed with simple apologies. I saw in their eyes a desperate desire for things to go back to the way they were, but that was impossible. The girl who had needed their approval, who had craved their validation, had died somewhere in the gray halls of Blackwood Asylum. I was someone else now. I need time, I told them, standing up, signaling the end of the meeting. A great deal of time. I don't know if I can ever look at you and not see those walls. I walked out of the room, leaving them with their regret, and felt not anger, not sadness, but a profound, quiet sense of release. I was finally, truly free of them. Months later, the world had found a new equilibrium. Lord Harrington's trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, stripped of his titles and his power. He raged and cursed in the courtroom. A madman finally revealed to the world, but his influence was gone. He was nothing. Dr. Blackwood was publicly disgraced. His asylum shut down pending a full investigation into its practices. Dr. Marlowe had his medical license revoked and fled the country in shame. The pillars of the world that had tried to crush me had crumbled into dust. I did not stay to watch them fall. I had used a small inheritance left to me by my grandmother, the only member of my family who had ever truly seen me, to purchase a small cottage in a coastal village, hundreds of miles from the city. It had a wild, overgrown garden and a view of the sea. I began to study botany, finding a quiet joy in the logic and resilience of the natural world. I learned the names of flowers, the properties of herbs, the patient, steady cycle of growth and decay. In the garden, I found the peace that the conservatory had once promised me, before it was tainted by violence. Alfred, cleared by the medical board but disillusioned with the system, resigned his position. He wrote to me often. His letters were full of his plans to open a small private clinic, one founded on the radical principles of listening, compassion, and trust. He wanted to help those who the world had discarded, to find the person behind the diagnosis. One bright spring afternoon, almost a year to the day I had escaped Blackwood, he came to visit. I was in my garden, my hands covered in dirt, when I saw him walking up the path. He looked different in the sunlight. Away from the gray shadows of the asylum, he looked happier, more at peace. He brought with him a rare orchid, a complex, beautiful flower that he knew I had been reading about. We sat on a small stone bench overlooking the sea, the scent of salt and roses in the air. "It suits you here," he said, looking at the color in my cheeks, the calm in my eyes. "I found my truth here," I replied, "not in a ballroom or a courtroom, but here, with the earth under my nails." Our friendship, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation, had transformed into something deep and quiet. a bond of mutual respect and profound understanding. There was a hint of something more, a possibility that lingered unspoken in the comfortable silence between us. But for now, this was enough. We were two survivors who had found our way back into the light. We had faced down the madness of the world and had chosen sanity, chosen truth, chosen each other. And so, looking back, I understand what that year taught me. It taught me that sanity is not a consensus. It is not something that can be voted on by your family or decreed by powerful men. It is a quiet, fierce, and often lonely belief in your own reality. It taught me that the most dangerous madmen are not the ones who rave in padded cells, but the ones who sit in gilded drawing rooms, their madness a cold, calculated cruelty they call power. They build asylums of denial around themselves and demand that the rest of the world live inside them. My story is about the day I refused, the day I decided to tear down the walls, not just of Blackwood Asylum, but the walls of fear and complicity my own family had built around me. And in their place, with my own hands, I built a garden. Thank you for listening to my story. The world is full of people who feel like their truth is being ignored, who feel like they are shouting into the wind. If my journey has taught me anything, it's the profound power of having just one person who is willing to listen, to believe. Share your own story in the comments below. If you feel comfortable, let's create a space where every voice is heard. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and vindication. Remember, you are the ultimate authority on your own life. Never let anyone, no matter how powerful, tell you that your reality is a delusion. Thank you for being here with me today.